Let's talk about that. There's been a huge debate coming out of the session about whether or not there is a correlation between per-student spending and performance. I mean, I've certainly been one of those who said, look, there are a lot of factors in this. And you can't just simply say that if you spend more money, then performance will improve. But I'll tell you that I was pleased to read in the Tribune. I sometimes read it as you all do when it shows up in the morning. That if you look at the assessment of the performance of schools, the exemplary, the recognized, the acceptable, and the unacceptable, in the last year, according to TEA, the exemplary schools spent about $1,000 per student more than the unacceptable schools. And as you go from exemplary to recognized, recognized to acceptable, acceptable, unacceptable, the schools that perform better according to the TEA's ratings have spent more money per student. That feels like a correlation to me.
But it's not a correlation of what money is divided to those districts.
Explain.
In fact, the biggest difference is I think exemplary was about 96,000 students, about 2% of our population, and most of them, in fact, if you take Frisco out, which is 37,000 kids, you've got most of them, those schools qualify for the mid-size adjustment. So the difference in spending on exemplary versus recognized is about $100.
So it does, maybe the numbers don't tell you the whole story.
No, they don't, and there are formula differences. You know,
Right.
there's student makeup, and if you look at the poverty side, you know, if you look at the WADA correction, I think statewide we've got about 27% greater WADA than actual students, and I think in that group it's about 1.10. You know, so they've got lower numbers of WADA, but they qualify for the mid-size adjustment. You know, below 5,000.
The Vice Chairman seems to perhaps want to disagree politely with your point.
I love you, but I will disagree politely with your point.
Well, that happens.
On a WADA basis, the numbers that are on their site, the numbers that TEA generated, the numbers that I asked TEA to generate back in one of our hearings, was on a WADA basis, did take into account the mid-size adjustment, and still got you $1,000 more per WADA, and those districts, those exemplary districts, as you point out, are educating a very small number of our low-income kids compared to the ones on the bottom. Now, I am the last person to say that money buys you performance.
About 18%.
Absolutely not. But if you were a betting person, I am not, but if you were a betting person, over the next 10 years, would you bet on the Yankees or the Kansas City Royals if you know nothing else other than the Yankees are going to have a whole lot of money and the Kansas City Royals aren't?
Have you seen the Yankees pitching this year? Mr. Feiner might differ with you on that.
I saw the Red Sox pitching about a week ago, but over a 10-year period, I looked at this in a bunch of different ways. I took a 3-year chart. I said maybe the 1 year is an exception. Maybe any district can do well in 1 year. If you look at 3 years, the districts that are consistently exemplary have the most money of all of the districts to spend. The districts that are consistently low performing have the least of all districts to spend.
Chairman, what about that?
When you say have to spend, and by the way, are we going to get into the Moneyball argument? Since you authored that book.
I authored the book.
No, you offered.
I'm happy to get into the
me.
Moneyball argument, but
You know, the story of the A's who didn't have the money, but found that the use of data and the important factors in performance.
Absolutely. And
right.
The day that we can build a system of 1,000 districts around the exceptions.
You don't have to build it around the exceptions.
Well, I mean, and that's sort of what this argument comes down to. Whenever we have this discussion, there are always districts that are outliers.
Yes.
There are always the districts that are performing a lot better than their money would show, and there are always the districts that are performing a lot worse than their money would show. But by and large, performance is going to be a bell curve. You're not going to have every administrator above average. You're not going to be able to create 8,000 excellent principals that are all able to do what that one general manager was able to do in baseball for a couple of years, which could then be replicated by the other teams. He had to do that. He had to do that to get even with what Boston and New York could do every single year without having to do that. And once they learn the formula, we're back to the same distribution.
Chairman.